Hello everybody, this is Mr. Yen, and this is the video lesson for 7.4b, where we are going to be talking about triangle congruence shortcuts. So let's switch over to the worksheet. Okay, you can pick this up from Google Classroom, and you can fill it out electronically and submit it that way, or print it out and write it in with me, or you can write in all the notes on a separate piece of paper. That's fine too. You're going to keep this in the notes section of your binders because you can reference it for other parts of this module and for module 8. In the previous lesson, we learned that if you only have 3 parts of triangles that are congruent, that may be enough information to conclude the 2 triangles are congruent. Let's look at this first example. In this example, this side is congruent to this side is congruent to this side, and then this third side, as it's marked, we can tell is also congruent to this third side. So the criteria that we have between these 2 triangles is they share 3 congruent sides. And the shorthand for this is, since it's 3 sides, it's a side, and a side that are congruent. So sometimes you might see that criteria as side, side, side. And when that's the case, we can conclude that the relationship between the 2 triangles is they are congruent. Next example. In this one, we have these 2 sides that are congruent between the 2 triangles, and this angle that's in between the 2 sides are also congruent. And so we can say that these 2 triangles share 2 sides and an included angle. The angle is in between the 2 sides. And that's congruent. So 2 sides and an included angle are congruent. And the shorthand that you might see for this is it's a side and then an angle in between the 2 sides. So we say side, angle, side. It's the included angle. When that's the case, we can conclude that those 2 triangles are congruent. Next example. These 2 triangles, you can see from the way that they're marked, have all of their corresponding angles congruent to each other. So the criteria is they share 3 congruent angles. And the shorthand for this is an angle, an angle, and an angle. So 3 A's. Now, when this is the case, we cannot conclude that they're congruent, but we can conclude that the relationship between the 2 triangles is that they are similar. And similar, right, that means that they are, it's like the same shape, but a different size. One is just a smaller or larger version of the other. And you can see from the way that this diagram looks that this triangle looks the same as this one on the left, but it's just a smaller version of it. So the 2 triangles are similar. Next criteria. These 2 triangles, they have these sets of congruent angles, these sets of congruent angles, and then this side that's in between the 2 angles. So we will say that these 2 triangles share 2 angles and an included side. As congruent. and an included angle, an included side. And the shorthand for this is it's an angle and then a side in between the two angles. So angle, side, angle, touching the two angles. The relationship, if that's the case, we can conclude that the two triangles are congruent. Next, here we have two right triangles. I know that they're right triangles because there's a right angle here in both of them. They have their hypotenuse or hypotenuses as congruent, and then one of the legs is congruent. So the criteria in this case is the two right triangles have hypotenuse and a leg congruent. The shorthand for this is hypotenuse, H, leg, L. The relationship between those two triangles, in this case, we can conclude that they are congruent. And we're going to make a little annotation here to remind ourselves that this only works, right, if with right triangles. So I'm going to say right triangles only. Because you have to have a right triangle for it to have a hypotenuse. So always look for that right angle symbol first before we can conclude it's hypotenuse leg. Last one. In these two triangles, we have an angle that's congruent. We have a side, and then this last side, but the angle is not in between the two sides. The angle is only touching one of the sides. So in this case, for the criteria, we will say that it is two sides and a non-included angle. That's congruent. And so you might see this as side, side, angle. We write it like this because the angle is not in between the two sides. It's not touching the two sides, only one of them. In this case, we cannot conclude that the triangles are congruent. So we can only just say that there's not enough information. We don't know that they're congruent. And you can see from this example, right, while the two triangles have a congruent angle and two sides, you can tell that they're actually not the same. That's an example of two non-congruent triangles. So as a guide for you, these are the criteria that you can conclude that the triangles are congruent. With this criteria, we cannot prove that they are congruent. All right, let's do one example from the set of problems that you have for today. This is number 1 on the second page. For each of these problems, you're going to list the congruences between the two triangles, say what criteria they share, conclude what type of relationship they have, and then if it's congruent, list the two triangles. For example, we know that side AC is congruent to side PQ. So I'll write that down. AC is congruent to PQ. Next, touching the side is we have these two angles. So I can say angle C is congruent to angle P. And then the last thing is this side. So CB is congruent to PR. So I'll say CB is congruent to PR. Small thing, the best way to write this one here is actually as QP. Okay, so the criteria, we have two congruent sides, and then the angle in between the two sides is congruent. So I will say, and I want you to write out the full criteria here, not just the shorthand. Two sides and an included angle are congruent. Then you can write the shorthand if you want. It's a side and then an angle and then a side that's congruent. If that's the case, we can conclude that these two triangles are congruent. And then since it's congruent, I'll fill out this bottom part. Triangle ACB is congruent to triangle. And remember, order matters here. So A is congruent to angle Q. So I'm going to list Q first. And then C is congruent to P. So say Q, P, R. Just like that. And so that's an example of how you're going to answer each of these questions. And so with that, I will say goodbye and good luck.